All right, let's now welcome Dr. Japheth Biegon, Africa Advocacy Coordinator at Amnesty International, to talk to us about the current meetings of the AU. Thank you so much for your time, Doctor. Welcome. So, elections, of course, for the Fifth Commission Chair to succeed Musa Faki. Who do you think are the current front runners, and who do you think will most likely assume this position, and why? Before we get into the nitty-gritties about what has been taking place at the back, at the sidelines of these talks today.
Thank you, Alicia, for having me. Unfortunately, I cannot be able to predict really who is the front runner or who is going to win. As an organization, as Amnesty International, we do not support or campaign against any candidate. What we require is that whoever candidate wins actually places human rights at the center of the organization and proceeds to defend and stand up for human rights. Absolutely, Doctor.
Well, all this taking place, as I alluded earlier, during a time where the body is currently under a lot of criticism, of course, pertaining to the current developments in the continent, especially the conflict in the Eastern DRC. Many really saying, what is the purpose of this body still? Antonio Guterres there, I'm sure you saw in our preceding clips, calling for an immediate ceasefire and for European powers to also stop arming people, but instead seek peaceful resolutions.
Yes, indeed. The election is really taking place at a watershed or pivotal moment. We've seen deepening crisis, not just in the DRC, but also in Sudan. There's been intensification of fighting in the last few weeks. And for us as Amnesty International, at top of the things that we are calling for include, one, that the African Union, member states, the international community, including the United Nations, must intensify the engagement, put pressure on the parties to these conflicts to ensure that they respect international human rights law, they respect international humanitarian law, and that they protect civilians. Two is that they expose the enablers of the current violations. Amnesty International last year, for instance, published a huge report showing that there is supply of weapons into Sudan, for instance, that is even reaching Darfur, an area that is covered by an arms embargo by the United Nations Security Council. And three, that they should make clear that suspected perpetrators will be held to account.
And speaking of that account and accountability, Doctor, well, the AU have also just convened a couple of days ago to basically discuss or put on the spotlight the current escalating security issues as well as issues in the continent. I mean, I know the South African delegation was part of these proceedings with the election of commissioners to oversee the bread and butter issues on the continent. But, Doctor, for a body that we hardly know of, unless there is, of course, a crisis that is ongoing, what powers do the AU even possess when it comes to the current as well as ongoing African challenges?
Yes, the AU Constitutive Act, the instrument that creates the AU, and also the Peace and Security Council Protocol, the instrument that creates the Peace and Security Council, really provides the African Union with a wide array of powers that they can use to leverage parties to conflicts, to actually comply with international human rights law, to protect civilians, and to respect human rights. For instance, they have the mandate to establish fact-finding missions or commissions of inquiry. And we saw in the last ministerial meeting on DRC by the Peace and Security Council, they actually decided to dispatch a fact-finding mission. So what is needed is to speedily dispatch such fact-finding mission so that it can document the human rights violations that are occurring, and that documentation will form the basis of holding perpetrators account. Similar to Sudan, Alicia, the African Commission has established a fact-finding missions. It needs to be deployed and well-resourced so that it may actually collect the evidence that is needed to hold perpetrators account and to ensure that civilians are protected. So there is indeed an array of powers that the African Union can use and leverage to ensure that actors respect and protect human rights.
But where have we seen some of their successes in these instances where they've had to mete out their powers, Doctor? I mean, this current conflict in the DRC is a 3 decades long type of conflict. We have not known, of course, of some of the behind the scenes talks. We've just heard of some of the resolutions pertaining to, of course, the deployment of soldiers by member states to go and assist in those conflict zones, right? So those are not necessarily peaceful solutions, and you cannot point to successes, particularly when there's been a huge loss of life.
Yes, indeed. When you look at the situation across the continent, and especially in conflict situations, the picture is bleak. And indeed, Alicia, many civilians, many citizens in conflict-ridden countries feel forgotten because often the African Union delays in responding, and maybe when it eventually responds, the response is not effective, is not bold, is not efficient. However, we have seen some rays of hope in instances where the African Union has acted effectively. In 2015, following the eruption of conflict in South Sudan, the African Union established a commission of inquiry that was headed by former President of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, and that fact-find commission of inquiry prepared a report that formed the basis of the peace agreement that was signed in 2015 and 2018. We saw that the African Union established the African chambers in Senegal that tried former President Hisne Habre in Senegal. And Hisne Habre was convicted of crimes against humanity and torture that was committed in Chad. Those two examples tells us that when there is political leadership, when there is political will, the African Union can actually act to protect civilians and hold perpetrators accountable. So it is possible for this to happen.
Just 2 examples that you've given me there, Doctor. I mean, we're still, I suppose, a very long way from finding those African solutions to African problems, right? Thank you so much for your input this afternoon. That is Dr. Japheth Biegon, the Africa Advocacy Coordinator at Amnesty International.